February 3, 1870, the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified. This amendment gave African American men the right to vote. However, Southern states would make it difficult for Black citizens to practice their right by creating various laws that prevented several of them from voting. Long before the 15th Amendment, slavery existed in many forms throughout history in the world. African slaves were initially brought to the Americas to work on plantations and were traded or sold. Slaves were also considered property and therefore denied basic rights. Prior to the ratification of the 15th Amendment, an era known as Reconstruction was formed in order to restore the nation after the Civil War. During this time, the United States tried bringing the Southern states back into the Union and determine the legal status of African Americans. The Reconstruction Amendments, known as the 13th and the 14th, were important steps formed during this period to abolish slavery, grant citizenship, and equal protection under the law. Reconstruction faced significant opposition from white Southerners who sought to maintain white supremacy and control over African Americans. The debate over the ratification of the 15th Amendment reflected issues between Congress and society. Southern states in particular practiced various tactics to disenfranchise African American voters, including poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. Most African Americans couldn't afford the poll tax, which prevented them from voting. Literacy tests were often made unfairly and inconsistently with African Americans, making it more difficult for them to pass. Some Southern states also used grandfather clauses, which exempted individuals from voting restrictions if their grandfathers had been eligible to vote before the Civil War. Since most African Americans' ancestors had been enslaved, they were automatically excluded from voting. In addition, African Americans who attempted to exercise their right to vote faced threats, violence, and intimidation from white supremacist groups such as the KKK. Lynchings, beatings, and other forms of violence were used to discourage African Americans from participating in the political process. Initially, women's rights activists such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were supportive of the amendment, but later opposed it because it excluded women. The 15th Amendment protects the right to vote from being denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2 empowers Congress to take action to ensure that the rights guaranteed by the 15th Amendment are upheld and enforced across the United States. In the 1903 case of Giles v. Harris, Jackson Giles, an African American citizen of Alabama, filed a lawsuit against the Montgomery County Sheriff Edgar Harris. He argued that the unfair voting requirements, such as poll taxes and literacy tests, violated the 15th Amendment. But the court ruled that they did not have the power to force the Southern states to obey the 15th Amendment, but rather only prohibited specific forms of racial discrimination in voting. For my legal opinion, the poll taxes and literacy tests technically do not discriminate against Black voters because it pertained to everyone. For my personal opinion, I think that the court should have had the power to enforce the 15th Amendment. In the 1944 case of Smith v. Allwright, Smith, an African American voter from Texas, filed a lawsuit against Allwright, the election judge for the Democratic Party, challenging the exclusion of African Americans from the primary elections. Smith argued that the white primary system violated his rights under the 15th Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Smith and declared the white primary system unconstitutional. For my legal opinion, I agree with the court's decision since he was discriminated against. For my personal opinion, I also agree since he was treated unfairly. The 1915 case, Gwynn v. United States, George Gwynn, an African-American citizen of Oklahoma, filed a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of Oklahoma's grandfather clause. Gwynn argued that the grandfather clause violated his rights under the 15th Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Gwynn and declared Oklahoma's grandfather clause unconstitutional. For my legal opinion, I agree with the court's decision because it denied his right to vote, knowing that his ancestors were slaves and unable to vote. For my personal opinion, I also agree because it seemed obvious what states were doing in order to prevent black citizens from voting. In conclusion, the 15th Amendment aimed to protect the voting rights of African American men. After the various laws passed to disenfranchise African Americans and weaken the 15th Amendment, the Supreme Court enacted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. By eliminating discriminatory practices such as literacy tests and poll taxes, the Voting Rights Act helped to remove long-standing barriers to voting and expand access to the ballot box for millions of Americans.